Oh, do come in. It seems we have another little puzzle on our hands, don't we?
Miss Marple and the cat on the parish roof. Welcome to Mindful Musings. I'm your host, William, and I'm delighted you've joined us today. Before we begin this evening's mystery, I'd love to hear from you. Where in the world are you listening from right now? Drop a comment and let me know. I read every single one. Now, settle into your favourite chair, pour yourself something warm, and let's step into the world of Miss Marple. Tonight's tale begins with a sound that pierced the quiet of St. Mary Mead on a fog-laden October morning, a cat's yowl that would lead to murder, most peculiar. Chapter 1. The yowling that woke the village. The fog had settled over St. Mary Mead like a damp woolen blanket, muffling the usual morning sounds of the village and lending everything an air of hushed expectancy. Miss Jane Marple had been awake since dawn, as was her custom, tending to her late autumn roses with the careful attention she brought to all matters of observation and cultivation. The garden was her particular pride, and even the encroaching chill of October could not diminish her dedication to its maintenance. It was precisely 20 minutes past 7 when the sound began. A cat's yowling, insistent and distressed, cutting through the fog with an urgency that immediately caught Miss Marple's attention. She straightened from her pruning, secateurs in hand, and tilted her head to better locate the source of the commotion. The sound was coming from the direction of the vicarage, that much was certain, though the fog made precise determination difficult. The yowling continued, rising and falling in pitch with a pattern that suggested genuine distress rather than the usual feline complaints about delayed breakfast or territorial disputes. Miss Marple had lived long enough to distinguish between the various vocalizations of cats, and this particular sound troubled her considerably. She set down her gardening tools with deliberate care and made her way toward the garden gate, her sensible shoes making soft sounds on the damp flagstones. As she emerged onto the lane, she encountered Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, hurrying in the opposite direction with her coat thrown hastily over her dressing gown. The woman's face was pale in the grey morning light, and her hands trembled as she clutched the coat closed at her throat. Miss Marple, thank goodness! Mrs. Clement's voice carried a tremor that had nothing to do with the morning chill. Have you heard that dreadful noise? I can't imagine what's got into Whiskers. He's been carrying on like that for nearly half an hour. Indeed, I have heard it, Miss Marple replied calmly, though her keen eyes were already scanning the direction of the vicarage with that particular intensity she reserved for situations that struck her as decidedly irregular. Has anyone investigated the source of his distress? Mrs. Clement shook her head, her greying curls escaping from the hasty bun she'd attempted. My husband went out some 10 minutes ago to locate the wretched animal, but he hasn't returned. I'm beginning to worry that something's happened. The fog is so thick one can barely see 10 feet ahead. The two women proceeded together toward the vicarage, their progress slowed by the need to navigate carefully through the oppressive fog. The yowling grew louder as they approached, and Miss Marple noted with interest that the sound seemed to be coming from above rather than ground level. This observation, though she kept it to herself for the moment, struck her as particularly significant. The vicarage loomed out of the fog before them, its familiar Georgian facade rendered strange and somewhat sinister by the grey shroud that obscured its upper stories. The yowling was definitely coming from somewhere near the roof, and as they drew closer, Miss Marple could make out a small orange shape perched precariously on the slate tiles, silhouetted against the lighter grey of the fog-laden sky. "There's Whiskers," Mrs. Clement exclaimed with obvious relief. "But whatever is he doing up there? He's terrified of heights. I've never known him to venture higher than the garden wall." Miss Marple did not immediately respond. Her attention had been caught by something else entirely, something that made her pulse quicken despite her habitual composure. Near the cat, barely visible through the swirling fog, was a darker shape, a shape that was decidedly not part of the vicarage's architecture. "Mrs. Clement," she said quietly, her hand reaching out to steady the other woman. "I believe we should summon Constable Polk immediately, and perhaps Dr. Haydock as well, though I rather suspect his services will be of limited use in this instance." "Whatever do you mean?" Mrs. Clement followed Miss Marple's gaze upward, squinting through the fog. "I don't see." Her words died abruptly as the fog shifted, providing a momentary clear view of the roof. The scream that followed was entirely justified by what they both now saw with terrible clarity. Sprawled across the vicarage roof, arms flung wide in an attitude of frozen surprise, lay the body of a man. Even from this distance, even through the lingering tendrils of fog, it was clear that he was quite beyond any earthly assistance. Chapter 2. The Body That Defied Gravity. The arrival of Constable Polk, Dr. Haydock, and eventually Inspector Slack transformed the quiet vicarage grounds into something resembling organised chaos. The fog had begun to lift, though wisps still clung to the eaves and chimneys, lending the scene an appropriately Gothic atmosphere. Miss Marple had positioned herself at a discreet distance, her expression one of mild interest, though anyone who knew her well would have recognised the sharp intelligence in those deceptively innocent blue eyes. The deceased had been identified as one Geoffrey Marchmont, a commercial traveller who had taken lodgings at the King's Arms 2 days previously. He was a man of perhaps 45 years, well dressed in a suit that had once been expensive, though it now showed signs of wear, with dark hair going grey at the temples and a face that death had frozen in an expression of profound astonishment. The question that occupied everyone's attention was not who the man was, but rather how he had come to be sprawled across the vicarage roof some 30 feet above the ground. Inspector Slack, a man whose confidence in his own judgment often exceeded the actual evidence at hand, had already formed a theory which he was expounding to Dr. Haydock with considerable satisfaction. "Clear case of accidental death," the inspector declared, gesturing toward the roof with his notebook. "Fellow had too much to drink at the pub last night, decided to take a shortcut through the vicarage grounds. Somehow managed to scramble up onto the roof. Probably thought he could get across to the other side and down the drain pipe. Lost his footing in the fog and fell. Simple as that." Dr. Haydock, who had been examining the body with his usual thoroughness, looked up with a frown. "I'm not entirely certain about that theory, Inspector. For one thing, there are no signs of the extensive injuries one would expect from a fall of that height. The man's neck is broken, certainly, but the pattern of damage suggests something rather different from a simple tumble." Inspector Slack waved this objection aside with obvious impatience. "Medical details, Doctor, I leave those to you. But the facts of the case are plain enough. No one could have carried a full-grown man up onto that roof without being seen. Therefore he must have climbed up himself." It was at this juncture that Miss Marple approached the small group, her expression one of mild inquiry. "I do beg your pardon, Inspector, but might I make a small observation?" I couldn't help but notice something rather curious about Mr. Marchmont's shoes. Inspector Slack's expression suggested that the last thing he needed was observations from elderly village ladies, but years of reluctant experience had taught him that Miss Marple's contributions, however irritating, occasionally proved relevant. "What about his shoes?" "They're spotless," Miss Marple replied simply. "Not a mark on them, no mud, no scuff marks, no sign whatsoever of the kind of damage one would expect from climbing up the rough stone walls of the vicarage or scrambling across slate tiles. In fact, they appear to have been recently polished." Dr. Haydock straightened up with obvious interest, moving to examine the deceased's footwear more closely. "Miss Marple is quite right. These shoes show no signs of the activity Inspector Slack is suggesting. Moreover, the soles are smooth leather, entirely unsuitable for climbing, and there's no indication of the kind of wear one would expect from such an endeavour." The inspector's expression had grown somewhat less confident. "Then how do you explain his presence on the roof?" Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles with a delicate gesture. "I would suggest, Inspector, that Mr. Marchmont did not climb onto the roof at all. He was carried there. The question we should be asking is not how he managed such an unlikely feat himself, but rather who possessed both the strength and the motive to place him there after his death. The silence that followed this pronouncement was broken only by the distant yowling of Whiskers, who had finally been rescued from his perch by the verger armed with a long ladder. The cat's ordeal, Miss Marple reflected, had been considerable, but his testimony, silent though it was, had proven invaluable. Inspector Slack found his voice first, though it carried a note of scepticism. "You're suggesting this was murder? That someone killed Marchmont elsewhere, carried his body up onto the vicarage roof and left it there for us to find?" "That's preposterous." "Is it?" Miss Marple's tone remained mild. "Consider the alternative. A man with smooth-soled shoes, showing no signs of exertion or climbing, somehow scales a 30-foot wall in dense fog and positions himself on a sloping roof where he subsequently dies. Which scenario strikes you as more preposterous, Inspector? Dr. Haydock intervened before the inspector could formulate a response. There's another factor to consider. The body shows signs of rigor mortis consistent with death occurring some 6 to 8 hours ago. That would place the time of death somewhere between midnight and 2 in the morning. The fog didn't roll in until around 5. If Marchmont had climbed up there in the night, he would have done so in relatively clear conditions. Miss Marple nodded approvingly. Precisely, Doctor, and surely someone would have heard or seen something if a man had been scrambling about on the vicarage roof in the middle of the night. The building directly overlooks the village square, yet no one reported any unusual activity. The Reverend Clement, who had been listening to this exchange with growing distress, spoke up hesitantly. I must say, I heard nothing unusual during the night. I'm a rather light sleeper, and any significant noise would certainly have woken me. The first disturbance was Whiskers this morning. Inspector Slack was beginning to look decidedly uncomfortable, a state of affairs that Miss Marple observed with quiet satisfaction. The inspector's tendency to leap to conclusions had been a source of considerable frustration in previous investigations, and she felt that a dose of humility might serve him well. Very well, the inspector said grudgingly. Assuming for the moment that you're correct about the body being placed on the roof, how was it done? The walls are sheer, there's no obvious means of access, and carrying a dead weight up a ladder would be nearly impossible for one person, even assuming they could do so without being observed. Miss Marple smiled gently. Ah, but that is precisely the question we must answer, Inspector, and I suspect that when we do, we shall find that the solution is both simpler and more ingenious than we might initially suppose. The murderer has presented us with an impossible crime, you see, and in my experience, impossible crimes are merely ordinary crimes, viewed from the wrong perspective. Chapter 3. The Shoes That Told No Lies. The morning had progressed into early afternoon by the time the body had been removed from the vicarage roof and transported to the morgue for Dr. Haydock's more thorough examination. Miss Marple had returned to her cottage ostensibly to attend to her neglected roses, but, in reality, to pursue a particular line of inquiry that had occurred to her during the morning's disturbing events. She had observed, with that careful attention to detail that characterized all her investigations, that Geoffrey Marchmont's shoes were not merely clean, but bore a particular kind of polish that suggested recent professional attention. This was not the hurried buffing a man might give his own footwear, but rather the careful application of technique and materials that mark the work of an expert. In a village the size of St. Mary Mead, there was only one establishment that provided such services. Mr. Dewberry's shoe repair shop occupied a narrow premises on the high street, sandwiched between the greengrocer's and the post office. The proprietor was a meticulous man in his 60s, who took considerable pride in his craft and possessed the kind of memory for faces and footwear that Miss Marple had been counting upon. "Good afternoon, Mr. Dewberry," she said pleasantly, as she entered the shop, the bell above the door announcing her arrival with a cheerful jangle. "I wonder if you might help me with a rather delicate matter. It concerns a gentleman who, I believe, may have been a customer of yours quite recently." Mr. Dewberry looked up from the boot he was rosoling, his weathered face creasing with interest. "Always happy to help you, Miss Marple. What gentleman might that be?" His name was Geoffrey Marchmont. He was staying at the King's Arms. "I'm afraid there's been a most unfortunate accident, and I'm trying to piece together his movements over the past few days." Miss Marple paused delicately. "I noticed his shoes were particularly well maintained, and I thought perhaps you might recall if he'd visited your shop." The shoe repairer's expression grew solemn at the mention of an accident, but he nodded with certainty. "Indeed, I remember him. Came in just yesterday afternoon, about 3 o'clock it would have been. Wanted his shoes cleaned and polished, said he had an important meeting that evening and needed to look presentable." Miss Marple's interest sharpened, though her expression remained one of gentle inquiry. "An important meeting? Did he happen to mention with whom?" Mr. Dewberry set down his tools and came to the counter, leaning forward conspiratorially. As a matter of fact, he did. Seemed quite anxious about it. Said he was meeting someone at the vicarage that evening to discuss a matter of considerable delicacy. Those were his exact words, matter of considerable delicacy. I remember because he repeated them twice. At the vicarage. Miss Marple kept her tone carefully neutral. How interesting. Did he say anything else about this meeting? Only that it concerned something he'd discovered about certain financial irregularities. Mr. Dewberry lowered his voice even further. Between you and me, Miss Marple, the gentleman seemed rather nervous, kept checking his watch and looking out the window as if he expected someone to appear at any moment. I got the impression he wasn't entirely comfortable with whatever business he was about. This information confirmed several of Miss Marple's developing suspicions, though it also raised new questions. She thanked Mr. Dewberry for his assistance and made her way thoughtfully back through the village, her mind working through the implications of what she'd learned. Geoffrey Marchmont had arranged to meet someone at the vicarage on the evening of his death. That person presumably was his murderer. Her next call was at the King's Arms, where the landlord, Mr. Crick, greeted her with the deference due to a valued member of the community. The pub's day room was quiet at this hour, with only a few regulars nursing their pints in the corner. Terrible business about Mr. Marchmont, Mr. Crick said, shaking his head sadly. Seemed a decent sort of gentleman. Kept himself to himself mostly, though he did receive a visitor yesterday evening. Miss Marple's pulse quickened, though her expression remained one of polite interest. A visitor? Might you be able to describe them? The landlord scratched his chin thoughtfully. Couldn't say for certain. It was getting dark, and they met outside in the courtyard rather than coming in. I only noticed because I was closing the curtains in the upstairs corridor and happened to glance out. Two figures, one I recognized as Mr. Marchmont from his height and bearing. The other was shorter, wearing a dark overcoat and hat. They spoke for perhaps 5 minutes, then walked off together in the direction of the church, in the direction of the vicarage. Miss Marple murmured. And what time would this have been? Just after 7 o'clock. I remember because the church bells had just finished ringing for evensong. Miss Marple thanked the landlord and accepted his offer of tea in the small private parlour, using the opportunity to examine the room that Marchmont had occupied. With Mr. Crick's permission and accompanied by the chambermaid, she conducted a thorough but discreet search of the premises. The room itself revealed little of immediate significance. Marchmont's belongings had been few and neatly arranged. A small valise containing clothes of respectable quality, though not expensive, toiletries, and a few personal items. What caught Miss Marple's attention was what was absent. There was no notebook, no papers of any kind, no indication of the financial documents that Marchmont had supposedly discovered. However, in the wastebasket, partially concealed beneath discarded newspaper, she found something that made her catch her breath. A torn envelope, addressed to Mr. Geoffrey Marchmont in a hand that was vaguely familiar, though she could not immediately place it. The postmark was local, dated 3 days previously. The envelope had been ripped open with some violence, and its contents were missing. Miss Marple carefully retrieved the envelope, noting that the return address had been torn away, leaving only a fragment that read merely Tun Hall. There were at least 3 properties in the district that could match such an address, but combined with what she had learned from Mr. Dewberry and Mr. Crick, the field of possibilities was narrowing considerably. As she made her way back to her cottage in the gathering twilight, Miss Marple reflected that the case was taking on a clearer shape. Geoffrey Marchmont had received a letter 3 days ago, had arranged a meeting at the vicarage to discuss financial irregularities, had met someone at the King's Arms who had accompanied him toward the church, and had subsequently ended up dead on the vicarage roof with spotlessly clean shoes that had never touched a ladder or a wall. The question that remained was not merely who had killed him, but how they had managed the seemingly impossible feat of placing his body 30 feet above the ground without leaving a single trace of the method employed. Chapter 4. The Ladder That Went Nowhere. Inspector Slack had established a temporary headquarters in the vicarage study, much to the discomfort of the Reverend Clement, who found his normally peaceful domain invaded by constables, witnesses, and the general paraphernalia of criminal investigation. Miss Marple had been invited, somewhat grudgingly, to attend the inspector's meeting with the various individuals who had been in or around the vicarage grounds on the evening in question. The first to be interviewed was Mrs. Clement herself, who sat perched nervously on the edge of an uncomfortable chair while the inspector reviewed his notes. Mrs. Clement, you stated that you and your husband retired at approximately 10 o'clock on the evening in question. Did you hear anything unusual during the night? Nothing whatsoever, Inspector, Mrs. Clement replied firmly. As I mentioned this morning, I'm normally quite alert to sounds in the night, particularly any that might indicate disturbance of the church or vicarage property. The first unusual sound was poor Whiskers this morning. Inspector Slack made a note of this. And your husband confirms this? Absolutely. We both slept undisturbed until the cat's yowling woke us just before 7. The verger, Mr. Purdy, was interviewed next, a solid man in his 50s, with the weathered hands of someone accustomed to outdoor work. He had been responsible for locking up the church after evensong and ensuring the grounds were secure. I did my usual rounds at 7:30. He reported in his methodical way, checked all the doors, made certain the windows were fastened, walked the perimeter of both the church and vicarage. Everything was as it should be. No signs of anything amiss. Miss Marple, who had been listening quietly from her position near the window, spoke up gently. Mr. Purdy, did you happen to notice whether the extension ladder was in its usual place in the tool shed? The verger looked surprised by the question. The ladder? Why, yes, Miss Marple. I didn't check inside the shed itself, but I certainly would have noticed if the ladder had been left out. It's kept against the back wall of the shed, quite visible through the window if one knows to look. Inspector Slack seized on this point with obvious interest. So the ladder was definitely in the shed at 7:30. And was it locked? The shed's locked every evening, yes, sir. I have one key and the vicar has the other. There's no other way to access it. This information presented a significant problem for any theory involving conventional means of reaching the roof. The only ladder long enough to reach the vicarage's upper story was securely locked away at the time when, according to Dr. Haydock's examination, the body must have been placed on the roof. Inspector Slack dismissed the verger and turned to Miss Marple with an expression of barely concealed frustration. I suppose you're going to tell me this proves your theory that the body was somehow levitated onto the roof by supernatural means. Not at all, Inspector, Miss Marple replied mildly. Merely that we must look beyond the obvious. If the conventional method of reaching the roof was unavailable, then an unconventional method must have been employed. The inspector's scepticism was evident. And what might that be? Before Miss Marple could respond, Dr. Haydock arrived with his preliminary report. The physician's expression was grave as he laid out his findings. Gentlemen, Miss Marple, I've completed my initial examination, and I must say the results are most peculiar. Geoffrey Marchmont died from a broken neck, as we observed. However, the break occurred at a specific point that suggests considerable force applied from behind and slightly to the side. In my professional opinion, this was not caused by a fall, but by a deliberate blow. Murder, then, Inspector Slack stated flatly. Undoubtedly, Dr. Haydock continued. Moreover, I found traces of rope fibre embedded in his clothing, particularly around the chest and under the arms. The pattern suggests he was bound or restrained with considerable force, and for a sufficient period that the fibres became embedded in the fabric. Miss Marple's eyes brightened with interest. Rope fibre. How very illuminating. And the body's position on the roof. Was it consistent with being dropped or thrown from above? Dr. Haydock shook his head. That's what makes this so peculiar. The position suggests the body was laid out, rather carefully, almost arranged. There's no sign of the tumbling or sliding one would expect from a body tossed onto a sloping surface. Someone took the time to position him quite deliberately. The inspector was beginning to look decidedly uncomfortable. This is all very well, but it doesn't explain how the devil anyone got a dead body onto that roof without a ladder, and without being seen or heard. It was at this moment that the Reverend Clement entered the room, his gentle face troubled. I do beg your pardon for interrupting, but I've just remembered something that may be relevant. Yesterday evening, around 8 o'clock, I did hear an unusual sound. At the time, I dismissed it as the wind or perhaps a loose shutter, but now I wonder. What sort of sound? Inspector Slack asked sharply. A rhythmic creaking, almost like a pulley or rope under strain. It lasted for perhaps 5 minutes, then stopped. I nearly went to investigate, but Mrs. Clement called me to attend to a domestic matter, and by the time I was free the sound had ceased. Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful glance with Dr. Haydock. A pulley system. How very ingenious. Inspector, I believe if you examine the vicarage roof more carefully you may find evidence of rope marks on the chimney stack or perhaps on the decorative stonework. The body wasn't carried up the conventional way at all. It was hoisted, like cargo onto a ship. The inspector's expression suggested he found this theory only marginally less improbable than his original supernatural hypothesis, but he dispatched Constable Polk to examine the roof with instructions to look for any signs of rope damage or wear. The constable returned within the hour, his face flushed with excitement. "Found them, sir? Clear marks on the west chimney stack where a rope's been passed round multiple times. Fresh damage too, you can see where it's scraped the stonework. There's even a bit of fibre caught in a crack." Inspector Slack's demeanour had shifted from scepticism to grudging acceptance, so someone rigged up a pulley system on the roof, hoisted the body up from ground level, and then removed all evidence of their method. It would take considerable strength and knowledge of mechanics. Or two people working together, Miss Marple suggested quietly. One to operate the pulley, one to guide the body, and it would need to be done in darkness to avoid detection, which explains why it was accomplished between 8 and 9 o'clock, after Mr. Purdy had completed his rounds, but before the streets became completely deserted. Chapter 5. The Cat Who Saw Everything. The following morning found Miss Marple in her garden once again, but her attention was not on her roses. Instead, she was observing Whiskers, the vicarage cat, who had taken up residence on her garden wall and was regarding her with that inscrutable expression common to felines who possess knowledge they have no intention of sharing. The cat's behaviour during and after the discovery of the body had been instructive to anyone who understood the language of animals. Miss Marple had spent considerable time over the years observing the habits of cats, and she recognised in Whisker's agitation something more specific than general feline hysteria. The cat had witnessed something that had disturbed him profoundly, and his insistence on remaining near the roof suggested the trauma had occurred in that specific location. Mrs. Clement appeared at the garden gate, looking somewhat better than she had the previous morning, though still clearly shaken by recent events. "Miss Marple, I do hope Whiskers isn't being a nuisance. He seems to have adopted your garden as his refuge. I can't persuade him to come home." "Not at all," Miss Marple replied warmly. "In fact, I was hoping you might join me for a cup of tea. I have some questions about Whisker's usual habits, if you wouldn't mind indulging my curiosity." Over tea in Miss Marple's sitting room, with Whiskers eventually persuaded to join them, and now purring contentedly on the windowsill, the conversation turned to the cat's regular patterns of behaviour. Mrs. Clement confirmed what Miss Marple had suspected. Whiskers was a creature of rigid routine, spending his nights indoors by preference, and venturing onto the roof only under the most extreme provocation. "He's absolutely terrified of heights," Mrs. Clement explained. "Even getting him down from a tree is an ordeal. For him to have climbed onto the vicarage roof voluntarily is simply unthinkable. Something must have driven him up there in a state of absolute panic." Miss Marple stroked the cat gently, noting how he flinched at any sudden movement and kept his eyes fixed on the window, as if expecting danger to appear at any moment. "What time does Whiskers typically go out for his evening constitutional?" "Around 7 o'clock, usually. He likes to patrol the churchyard, though he's always back by 8 for his supper." Mrs. Clement paused, a troubled expression crossing her face. "Now that I think about it, he didn't come for his supper that evening. I called for him repeatedly, but he never appeared. I assumed he'd been detained by a particularly interesting mouse or some such thing. When I found him the next morning on the roof, I realised he must have been up there all night." This information aligned perfectly with Miss Marple's developing theory. Whiskers had witnessed the murder or the disposal of the body, had fled in terror to the highest point he could reach, and had remained there throughout the night, too frightened to descend. The cat, in his way, was providing testimony more reliable than any human witness might offer. Miss Marple spent the afternoon in quiet contemplation, reviewing everything she had learned. The pieces were beginning to form a coherent picture, though several crucial elements remained unclear. She knew that Geoffrey Marchmont had discovered financial irregularities, had arranged a meeting at the vicarage to discuss these matters, and had been murdered shortly after arriving for that meeting. She knew that his body had been hoisted onto the roof using a pulley system, a method that required planning, strength, and a certain ruthless ingenuity. What she did not yet know was the identity of the murderer, though she had her suspicions. The torn envelope with its partial address of Tun Hall pointed to one of 3 possibilities in the district, but without more concrete evidence, she could not be certain which one was involved. It was while she was mulling over this problem that her great-nephew, Raymond West, arrived for an unexpected visit. The young writer, whose metropolitan sophistication often clashed amusingly with village life, had heard of the murder and come down from London driven by a combination of genuine concern for his aunt and professional curiosity about the crime. "Aunt Jane, this is absolutely remarkable," Raymond exclaimed as Miss Marple recounted the basic facts of the case over afternoon tea. A body on a church roof, a terrified cat, rope marks on a chimney. It's like something from one of those detective novels you're always reading. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Life often imitates art, my dear, though I've found that real crimes are generally less elaborate than fictional ones, even when they appear complex. The difficulty lies not in the method, which is usually quite straightforward once understood, but in determining who had both the motive and the opportunity." Raymond leaned forward with interest. "And have you determined that?" "I have several theories," Miss Marple admitted, "but theories require evidence, and evidence requires investigation, which is why I was hoping you might be willing to help me with a small errand." The errand in question involved Raymond using his London connections to make discreet inquiries about 3 individuals connected to properties that matched the partial address on the torn envelope. These were Colonel Melchett of Melchton Hall, Sir Henry Clithering of Duntington Hall, and most intriguingly, a Mr. James Pettigrew, who had recently purchased Kensington Hall, a modest estate on the outskirts of the village. Raymond departed with his assignment, promising to telephone with any information he uncovered. Miss Marple returned to her garden, where Whiskers had resumed his position on the wall, watching her with those knowing eyes that suggested he understood far more than he could communicate. "You saw it all, didn't you?" Miss Marple said softly to the cat. "You know who killed Geoffrey Marchmont and why. If only you could tell me what you witnessed, this whole sorry business would be resolved in an instant." Whiskers merely blinked slowly, that most enigmatic of feline gestures, and continued his vigil. But Miss Marple noticed something she hadn't observed before. The cat's attention was not randomly directed, but focused with remarkable consistency on a particular property visible from the garden wall, the newly occupied Kensington Hall, with its distinctive bell tower and freshly painted shutters. Chapter 6. The Bell Tower with a Secret View. Raymond West telephoned the following morning with news that confirmed Miss Marple's developing suspicions. Mr. James Pettigrew, the new owner of Kensington Hall, was not quite the respectable country gentleman he had represented himself to be. Raymond's inquiries had revealed that Pettigrew had recently been involved in several dubious financial ventures, including a failed investment scheme that had left numerous small investors impoverished. More intriguingly, Geoffrey Marchmont had been employed by one of the regulatory bodies investigating these schemes. His role had been that of a forensic accountant, someone skilled at tracing the flow of money through complex corporate structures. According to Raymond's sources, Marchmont had been pursuing a particular lead that had brought him to St. Mary Mead and to the attention of James Pettigrew. Miss Marple absorbed this information with quiet satisfaction. The motive was now clear. Marchmont had discovered evidence of Pettigrew's financial crimes and had arranged to meet someone at the vicarage to discuss his findings, possibly with the intention of involving the local authorities. Pettigrew, desperate to prevent exposure, had committed murder to silence the investigation. What remained unclear was how Pettigrew had managed to transport the body to the vicarage and hoist it onto the roof, a feat that would have required both careful planning and physical capability. The solution to this puzzle, Miss Marple suspected, lay in understanding the precise geography of the properties involved and the opportunities they presented for concealment. She decided a personal reconnaissance was in order. Kensington Hall bordered the vicarage property at its western edge, separated only by a thick belt of yew trees that had been planted generations ago to mark the boundary. The hall itself was a modest Georgian building, notable primarily for its distinctive bell tower, a decorative structure that rose 3 stories above the main roof and offered commanding views of the surrounding countryside. Miss Marple arranged to visit Kensington Hall under the pretext of welcoming the new owner to the neighbourhood, a social obligation that would not seem unusual or suspicious. She was received by James Pettigrew in his study, a wood-panelled room that smelled of old books and newer money. Pettigrew himself was a man of perhaps 50, with the kind of smooth, prosperous appearance that comes from good tailoring and regular meals at expensive restaurants. His manner was affable, his conversation polished, and his hospitality generous. To the casual observer, he would have seemed exactly what he claimed to be, a successful businessman seeking the tranquility of country life after years in the city. But Miss Marple had not spent decades observing human nature without developing an instinct for detecting facades. She noted the nervous energy beneath Pettigrew's genial exterior, the way his eyes flickered constantly to the windows overlooking the vicarage, the slight tremor in his hands when he poured the tea. "You have a magnificent view from here," Miss Marple observed, moving to the window with her teacup. "One can see the entire village, including the vicarage and church. That bell tower must provide an even more spectacular prospect." Pettigrew's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Indeed, the tower was originally built as a folly by the previous owner. "I've been meaning to convert it into a proper observatory. The views are, as you say, quite spectacular." Miss Marple expressed polite interest in seeing the tower, and Pettigrew, trapped by the conventions of hospitality, could hardly refuse. They ascended the narrow spiral staircase, emerging onto a small platform that offered unobstructed views in all directions. As Miss Marple had suspected, the vicarage roof was clearly visible, perhaps 50 yards away, and at roughly the same elevation as the tower platform. "What a marvellous vantage point!" Miss Marple murmured, though her attention was focused not on the pastoral vista, but on several details that confirmed her suspicions. The platform's stone railing bore fresh scratches consistent with rope abrasion, and there were faint marks on the wooden floor suggesting something heavy had been dragged to the edge. More tellingly, a bracket mounted to the wall showed signs of recent use. Its purpose was ostensibly to hold a telescope or flagpole, but Miss Marple recognized it as ideally positioned for securing the upper end of a pulley system. From this height, a rope could be extended across the gap to the vicarage, and with a second pulley anchored to the chimney stack she had already examined, a body could be transported horizontally through the air under cover of darkness. The ingenuity of the method was striking. No need to carry a corpse through the village streets, no risk of being observed climbing ladders or scrambling over walls. Simply hoist the body from ground level at Kensington Hall, swing it across the gap between properties using the rope as a guide, and lower it carefully onto the vicarage roof. The entire operation could be accomplished in minutes by someone with basic knowledge of mechanics and sufficient nerve to execute the plan. Inspector Slack, when Miss Marple shared these observations later that afternoon, was initially sceptical but increasingly convinced as she laid out the evidence. "The geography alone is suggestive," she explained, spreading a map of the area on the vicarage study table. "Kensington Hall and the vicarage are separated by perhaps 40 yards at their closest point, with the bell tower and the vicarage roof at nearly identical elevations. A rope stretched between them would form a perfect aerial pathway. But why go to such elaborate lengths?" the inspector protested. "Why not simply bury the body or dispose of it in the conventional manner?" "Because," Miss Marple replied patiently, "Mr. Pettigrew needed to create a puzzle that would direct suspicion away from himself. A body discovered on the vicarage roof with no apparent means of access would naturally focus investigation on the vicarage and church grounds. No one would think to look at neighbouring properties for the solution. It was an attempt to create an impossible crime, one that would baffle investigators long enough for Pettigrew to complete whatever financial arrangements he needed to make before fleeing the country." Dr. Haydock, who had joined them for this discussion, nodded thoughtfully. "It explains the careful positioning of the body as well. Pettigrew lowered it onto the roof and arranged it to look as natural as possible, given the circumstances. He couldn't simply drop it from the tower. The impact would have caused additional injuries that would have been inconsistent with his scenario." Inspector Slack was won over. "We'll need to search Kensington Hall for evidence of the rope and pulley system. If Pettigrew hasn't disposed of them yet, we should find them readily enough. And I'll want statements from anyone who might have observed activity at the hall on the evening in question." The search warrant was obtained with commendable speed, and by evening a thorough examination of Kensington Hall was underway. In a storage room adjacent to the bell tower, constables discovered coils of strong rope showing fresh wear, a set of pulleys of the type used in sailing, and most damningly, a pair of work gloves with rope burns on the palms. The gloves, when examined more closely, also bore traces of blood that Dr. Haydock confirmed matched Geoffrey Marchmont's type. James Pettigrew, confronted with this evidence, initially attempted to maintain his innocence. But when informed that Whiskers the cat had been on the vicarage grounds during the crucial period and might well have observed the body being lowered onto the roof, an observation that could corroborate the prosecution's theory of the crime, his resolve crumbled. "Very well," he said wearily, his prosperous facade finally cracking. "I suppose there's no point in denial." Marchmont had discovered certain irregularities in my business affairs. He contacted me demanding money to suppress his findings. I agreed to meet him at the vicarage, thinking the location neutral enough to avoid suspicion. Inspector Slack made careful notes. "Go on." "We met in the churchyard at 8 o'clock. He had documents, proof of my activities. When I refused to pay his demands, he threatened to go directly to the authorities. We argued, the argument became physical, and in the struggle I struck him." Pettigrew's voice had grown hollow. "I didn't intend to kill him, but the blow broke his neck. He died almost instantly." "And then you conceived the plan to dispose of the body on the vicarage roof?" Miss Marple said, quietly. Pettigrew nodded. "I dragged the body back to Kensington Hall through the yew trees. It was dark, foggy, no one saw us. I'd done some sailing, knew about rigging pulley systems. It took me nearly an hour to set up the ropes between the tower and the vicarage chimney. Then I hoisted the body up and across, lowered it onto the roof, and removed all traces of my equipment. Or so I thought." "You would have succeeded," Inspector Slack observed grimly, "if not for Miss Marple's observations, and that confounded cat." Chapter 7. The Documents Hidden in Plain Sight. With James Pettigrew in custody and his confession secured, Inspector Slack considered the case effectively closed. However, Miss Marple found herself troubled by several loose ends that suggested the story was not quite as simple as Pettigrew had presented it. In particular, she was curious about the documents that Geoffrey Marchmont had supposedly brought to his fatal meeting. Pettigrew claimed that Marchmont possessed proof of financial irregularities, yet no such documents had been found on the body or in Marchmont's room at the King's Arms. Either Pettigrew had disposed of them after the murder, or they were hidden somewhere Miss Marple had not yet thought to look. She returned to the King's Arms with Mrs. Bantry in tow, the latter having insisted on accompanying her friend on what she termed a proper investigative expedition. Together they conducted a more thorough search of Marchmont's former room, this time focusing not on what was present, but on what might be concealed. It was Mrs. Bantry who made the discovery, quite by accident, when she leaned against the washstand and felt something shift beneath her weight. The basin's pedestal was not as solidly attached as it appeared, and further examination revealed that it had been deliberately loosened. Concealed in the hollow space beneath were several folders of documents, carefully wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from moisture. The papers told a damning story. Marchmont had been investigating a complex scheme in which Pettigrew had defrauded investors of nearly £50,000 through a series of shell companies and fraudulent property developments. The evidence was meticulously compiled, with bank statements, forged contracts, and correspondence that proved Pettigrew's guilt beyond any doubt. More intriguingly, the documents also revealed that Marchmont had not been working alone. He had been in communication with someone in St. Mary Mead, who had provided crucial information about Pettigrew's local activities. The letters were signed only with the initials R.C., and Miss Marple's first thought was that these belonged to the Reverend Clement. However, when she discreetly raised the matter with the vicar over tea that afternoon, his bewilderment seemed entirely genuine. He knew nothing of any investigation into Pettigrew's affairs, and had certainly never corresponded with Geoffrey Marchmont on any subject whatsoever. This left Miss Marple with a puzzle. Who in the village had the initials R.C. and sufficient knowledge of Pettigrew's activities to assist in an investigation? She compiled a mental list of possibilities and began the patient work of elimination. Her inquiries led her eventually to Rosa Carmichael, a retired schoolmistress who lived in a cottage near Kensington Hall. Miss Carmichael was a sharp-eyed woman in her 70s who had taught generations of village children and now spent her retirement observing the world from behind her lace curtains with the keen interest of someone who understood that knowledge was power. Miss Marple called upon her under the pretext of discussing a church charity project, and it took very little prompting to turn the conversation toward recent events and the new occupant of Kensington Hall. A thoroughly unpleasant man. Miss Carmichael declared with the forthrightness of someone too old to care about polite prevarications. I knew from the moment he arrived that something wasn't right about him. Too smooth, too careful in his speech, and the visitors he received at odd hours suggested business of a questionable nature. Miss Marple expressed polite interest, and Miss Carmichael continued with growing animation. I made it my business to observe his comings and goings. One doesn't spend 40 years teaching children without developing an instinct for detecting mischief. When that gentleman from London arrived, the one asking questions about investments and property schemes, I knew something significant was afoot. "Geoffrey Marchmont," Miss Marple supplied gently. "Yes, though I didn't know his name at the time. He came to see me one afternoon, explained he was investigating financial fraud, and asked if I'd observed anything unusual at Kensington Hall." Miss Carmichael's expression was one of grim satisfaction. I told him everything I'd seen, the late-night meetings, the suspicious visitors, the documents I'd observed being burned in the garden incinerator. I even provided him with dates and times from my diary. "So, you were his local informant, the person with the initials RC who provided crucial evidence." I suppose I was, though I hardly thought of it in such dramatic terms. I was simply doing my civic duty. Miss Carmichael paused, her expression growing troubled. "I must confess, Miss Marple, I feel somewhat responsible for what happened. If I hadn't encouraged Mr. Marchmont in his investigation, he might still be alive." Miss Marple reached across to pat the other woman's hand reassuringly. "You mustn't think that way, my dear. You were helping to expose wrongdoing. The responsibility for Mr. Marchmont's death rests entirely with James Pettigrew, who chose murder rather than facing the consequences of his crimes." Miss Carmichael was somewhat comforted by this, though she remained visibly distressed. "There's something else that troubles me. On the evening of the murder, I saw something from my window that I haven't mentioned to the police because I wasn't certain of its significance." Miss Marple's attention sharpened. "What did you see?" "A second figure. After Pettigrew and Marchmont entered the churchyard together, I saw someone else following them at a distance. It was dark and foggy, so I couldn't make out any details, but there was definitely a third person present." Miss Carmichael wrung her hands nervously. "I've been wondering whether I should tell Inspector Slack, but I'm afraid he'll think me a fanciful old woman seeing shadows in the fog." "On the contrary," Miss Marple said firmly, "I think you should tell the inspector immediately. This could be highly significant. It suggests that Pettigrew may not have acted entirely alone, or at the very least, that there was a witness to the crime who has remained silent." Inspector Slack, when informed of this new information, was initially sceptical but agreed to question Pettigrew more thoroughly about the possibility of an accomplice. The prisoner, faced with Miss Carmichael's testimony, finally admitted what he had previously concealed. There was someone else, he acknowledged reluctantly. "My secretary, Martin Voss. He had accompanied me from London and was aware of Marchmont's investigation. When I went to meet Marchmont in the churchyard, Voss followed us, thinking I might need assistance. He witnessed the entire altercation and the aftermath." "And where is Mr. Voss now?" the inspector demanded. "Gone," Pettigrew said bitterly. "He helped me rig the pulley system and dispose of the body, then demanded money for his silence. I paid him, and he left for the continent the following morning. Claimed he wanted no further part in the affair. This revelation complicated matters considerably. Martin Voss was now an accomplice to murder and needed to be apprehended before he could disappear entirely." Inspector Slack immediately contacted Scotland Yard, and a description of Voss was circulated to all ports and railway stations. Miss Marple, however, was troubled by a different aspect of Pettigrew's revised confession. The story of an accomplice demanding money and fleeing the country was certainly plausible, but something about it rang false to her experienced ear. She suspected that Martin Voss's role in the affair had been rather more significant than Pettigrew was admitting. Chapter 8. The Secretary Who Knew Too Much. The search for Martin Voss proved more complex than Inspector Slack had anticipated. The secretary had indeed left St. Mary Mead on the morning after the murder, but his trail had gone cold at Dover, where he had apparently booked passage to Calais, but never boarded the scheduled ferry. It was as if he had simply vanished into the morning mist. Miss Marple, pondering this development over her morning tea, found herself increasingly certain that Voss had not fled to the continent at all. A man who had witnessed a murder and assisted in disposing of the body would surely be concerned about his own safety. If he knew too much about Pettigrew's crimes, he would be a liability that Pettigrew might well decide to eliminate once the initial crisis had passed. She shared these thoughts with Raymond, who had remained in St. Mary Mead to see the case through to its conclusion. The young writer's imagination was captured by the idea of a second victim, and he threw himself enthusiastically into helping his aunt investigate this new angle. If Voss didn't leave the country, Raymond mused, then where is he? Could Pettigrew have killed him as well and hidden the body somewhere on the property? It's certainly possible, Miss Marple agreed, though I suspect if that were the case, the body would have been discovered during the search of Kensington Hall. No, I think Mr. Voss is alive but in hiding, perhaps hoping to use his knowledge of the murder as leverage for a permanent source of income. But hiding where? In a village this size, a stranger would be noticed immediately. Unless, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, he's not exactly hiding as a stranger. Suppose he had established himself in the village before the murder, perhaps under a different identity, so that his presence would not seem unusual or suspicious. This theory sent them back to reviewing everyone who had recently arrived in St. Mary Mead, or whose presence during the crucial period might have been noteworthy. The list was surprisingly short. Apart from Geoffrey Marchmont himself, there had been few newcomers to the village in recent weeks. However, Raymond recalled something that had seemed insignificant at the time. The King's Arms had taken on a new ostler just over a week ago, a quiet man named Matthew Voss, who kept to himself and performed his duties with competent efficiency. The surname was hardly an uncommon one, but the coincidence was worth investigating. Miss Marple and Raymond paid a visit to the King's Arms, where Mr. Crick confirmed that the new ostler was indeed named Matthew Voss. He had arrived with references from a hotel in London, had proven satisfactory in his work, and lived in a small room above the stables. The landlord knew little else about him, as the man rarely engaged in conversation and spent his free time in his quarters rather than socialising in the tap room. When they requested to speak with Voss, however, Mr. Crick informed them that the ostler had not appeared for work that morning and had not been seen since the previous evening. His room, when examined, showed signs of hasty departure, with clothes left scattered and personal items abandoned. Inspector Slack, summoned to investigate this new development, was forced to confront the uncomfortable possibility that Martin and Matthew Voss were the same person, and that the secretary had been in St. Mary Mead throughout the period leading up to the murder, not merely accompanying Pettigrew from London as the prisoner had claimed. "We need to question Pettigrew again," the inspector declared. "This changes the entire complexion of the case. If Voss was already in place, working at the King's Arms, he could have been monitoring Marchmont's activities from the beginning. The renewed interrogation of James Pettigrew produced a fuller and considerably more disturbing version of events. Faced with evidence of Voss's presence in the village before the murder, Pettigrew finally admitted the truth. The secretary had not merely assisted in disposing of Marchmont's body. He had been an active participant in planning and executing the murder. Voss came down from London a week before I did. Pettigrew explained, his confidence finally shattered. His job was to monitor Marchmont, find out what evidence he'd gathered and who he'd been in contact with. The position at the King's Arms was ideal for that purpose. He could observe Marchmont's comings and goings, intercept his correspondence if necessary, and report back to me. "And the murder itself?" Inspector Slack pressed. "Voss was there. He helped me overpower Marchmont when the argument turned violent. In fact—" Pettigrew's voice dropped to barely a whisper. It was Voss who actually broke Marchmont's neck. "I struck the first blow, but Voss finished it. He claimed we had no choice, that Marchmont had seen too much and would never agree to keep silent." Miss Marple listened to this confession with a sense of profound sadness. What had begun as financial fraud had escalated through desperation and ruthlessness to murder, and now it appeared that Martin Voss had been not merely an accomplice, but possibly the driving force behind the killing. The question now was where Voss had gone, and whether he posed a danger to anyone else in the village. Miss Marple suspected that the secretary had remained hidden nearby, waiting for an opportunity to flee once he was certain the investigation had concluded. But Pettigrew's confession and the discovery of his true identity had forced him to abandon his cover and run. Inspector Slack organised search parties to comb the surrounding countryside, while Miss Marple pursued a different line of inquiry. If Voss had been in the village for a week before the murder, someone must have observed him, spoken with him, perhaps noticed something that would provide a clue to his current whereabouts. It was young Flora, the baker's daughter, who provided the crucial information. She had encountered the ostler several times when delivering bread to the King's Arms, and had noticed that he seemed particularly interested in the old boathouse on the riverbank at the edge of the village. She had seen him walking in that direction on his afternoon off, and had thought his interest odd since the boathouse had been abandoned for years. Miss Marple thanked the girl for this information and immediately contacted Inspector Slack. The boathouse was isolated, little visited, and would provide ideal temporary shelter for someone needing to hide. If Voss was still in the area, that's where they would find him. Chapter 9. The Boathouse at River's Bend. The old boathouse stood at a remote bend in the river, nearly a mile from the village proper, and accessible only by a narrow footpath that wound through dense undergrowth. It had been built in the previous century to serve a grand estate that had long since fallen into ruin, and now the structure itself was barely habitable, its wooden walls weathered to grey, its roof sagging under the weight of accumulated years and neglect. Inspector Slack approached the building with appropriate caution, accompanied by Constable Polk and 2 officers borrowed from the neighbouring parish. Miss Marple had been firmly instructed to remain at a safe distance, an instruction she had accepted with apparent meekness, while privately determining to position herself where she could observe the proceedings. The raid, if it could be called that, proceeded with anticlimactic efficiency. Martin Voss was discovered inside the boathouse, huddled in a sleeping bag with provisions that suggested he had been planning to remain hidden for some time. He offered no resistance when arrested, his spirit apparently broken by the realization that his situation was hopeless. Voss was a slight man in his 40s, with the kind of nondescript features that would allow him to blend into any crowd unnoticed. His expression as he was led away was one of resignation rather than defiance, and Miss Marple noted with interest that he seemed almost relieved to have been caught. The subsequent interview at the police station revealed a story of progressive moral decay that was both tragic and instructive. Voss had begun his association with Pettigrew as a legitimate secretary, but had gradually been drawn into increasingly questionable activities as his employer's financial schemes became more desperate and illegal. By the time Geoffrey Marchmont's investigation threatened to expose everything, Voss had been so deeply implicated that he saw no alternative to helping eliminate the threat. "I never intended to become a murderer," Voss said wearily, his voice carrying the weight of genuine remorse. "When we went to meet Marchmont in the churchyard, I thought we were simply going to intimidate him, perhaps threaten him into silence. But when he refused to back down, when he made it clear he was going to the authorities regardless of any threats, something in me snapped." "So, it was you who killed him," Inspector Slack stated. Voss nodded slowly. "Pettigrew struck the first blow, yes, but it wasn't enough. Marchmont was still conscious, still trying to call for help. I grabbed him from behind and twisted. I'd learned the technique in the army during the war. One quick motion, and it was over." Voss closed his eyes as if trying to block out the memory. "Then we had to deal with the body, and that's when Pettigrew came up with the idea of using the bell tower and the pulley system." Miss Marple, listening from the corridor where she had been, permitted to wait, felt the familiar sadness that always accompanied the solution of a murder case. 2 men, both fundamentally weak in different ways, had allowed circumstances to transform them into killers. Pettigrew's greed and Voss's misplaced loyalty had created a lethal combination that had destroyed 3 lives, Geoffrey Marchmont's, their own, and by extension, the many victims of Pettigrew's financial frauds. The inspector's questioning continued for some time, extracting every detail of the crime and its aftermath. Voss confirmed that they had transported Marchmont's body from the churchyard to Kensington Hall by dragging it through the belt of yew trees that provided cover from observation. The pulley system had taken nearly an hour to rig properly, with Voss operating the mechanism from the bell tower, while Pettigrew guided the body across the gap. The placement on the vicarage roof had been Pettigrew's idea, Voss explained. He thought it would create such a puzzle that investigators would waste time trying to solve the impossible crime rather than looking for conventional motives and suspects, and it nearly worked, didn't it? If not for Miss Marple's observations about the shoes and the rope marks, you might never have connected the crime to Kensington Hall. Inspector Slack grudgingly acknowledged this truth, though he made it clear that the investigation would have eventually reached the correct conclusion through proper police work. Miss Marple, overhearing this assertion, smiled gently to herself and refrained from pointing out that without her intervention, the case might well have been closed as an accidental death. The final piece of the puzzle concerned Whiskers the cat. Voss confirmed that the animal had indeed been present in the churchyard during the murder, had witnessed the entire attack, and had fled in terror onto the vicarage roof where it had remained throughout the night. The cat's distress had been what ultimately led to the discovery of the body, a fact that seemed to amuse Voss in a grim sort of way. "Betrayed by a cat," he murmured. "There's a certain poetic justice in that, I suppose. We tried to create an impossible mystery, and it was solved by the most ordinary of observations: a frightened animal, spotless shoes, rope marks on stone, the truth hiding in plain sight all along." As Voss was led away to the cells, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the nature of deception and detection. The murderers had indeed created an impressive puzzle, one that relied on mechanical ingenuity and careful planning, but they had failed to account for the small details that always betrayed the truth to those patient enough to observe them. Raymond joined his aunt as she prepared to leave the police station, his expression one of mingled admiration and curiosity. "How did you know, Aunt Jane? How did you see through all the misdirection to find the real solution?" Miss Marple adjusted her gloves with careful precision. "I simply paid attention, my dear. To the shoes that had never touched a ladder, to the cat who was terrified of heights, to the geography of the properties, to the human tendency to overcomplicate what should be simple. Murder is rarely as mysterious as it appears. One merely needs to look past the elaborate staging to see the mundane reality beneath." "But surely this case was more complex than most," Raymond protested. "The pulley system, the aerial transport of the body, the attempt to create an impossible crime? Complex in execution, perhaps." Miss Marple agreed, but simple in motive: greed, fear of exposure, the willingness to kill rather than face consequences. These are the oldest stories in human nature, dressed up in new clothes but fundamentally unchanged. Once you understand the people involved, the method becomes almost predictable. Chapter 10. The village returns to peace. The trial of James Pettigrew and Martin Voss drew considerable attention from the London newspapers, which found the details of the aerial transport and the cat witness irresistible material for sensational reporting. Miss Marple observed this media circus with her usual detachment, declining all requests for interviews and maintaining her preference for quiet observation over public attention. The legal proceedings were mercifully brief. Both defendants pleaded guilty to murder, sparing the village the ordeal of a lengthy trial and the associated publicity. Pettigrew received a life sentence, while Voss, whose direct responsibility for Marchmont's death was clearly established, was condemned to hang, though this sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment on appeal. The resolution of the case brought both closure and melancholy to St. Mary Mead. Geoffrey Marchmont's body was claimed by distant relatives and transported to London for burial. His investigation into Pettigrew's financial crimes was taken up by the authorities, resulting in the recovery of some funds for the defrauded investors, though many would never fully recoup their losses. Kensington Hall stood empty for some months before being purchased by a retired naval officer, whose respectability was thoroughly vetted by the village before he was accepted into local society. The bell tower, scene of such ingenious criminality, was converted into the observatory Pettigrew had claimed to be planning, though its new owner never used it without remembering the dark purpose it had once served. Miss Marple's role in solving the case was acknowledged by Inspector Slack with grudging respect, though he maintained that proper police work would have reached the same conclusions eventually. Miss Marple accepted this assertion with equanimity, understanding that the inspector needed to preserve his professional pride, even as he recognized the value of her contributions. The Reverend Clement and his wife, initially distressed by the discovery that their property had been used as the final resting place for a murder victim, gradually recovered their composure. Mrs. Clement was particularly grateful to Miss Marple for explaining how Whiskers had been an unwitting witness, rather than a participant in the tragic events. The cat himself had recovered from his ordeal with the resilience characteristic of his species. He returned to his usual routines, though Miss Marple noticed that he continued to avoid the vicarage roof and regarded the direction of Kensington Hall with visible unease. Animals, she reflected, had longer memories for trauma than humans sometimes credited. It was on a crisp November morning, some weeks after the trial's conclusion, that Miss Marple found herself once again in her garden, tending to her roses and reflecting on the case. The garden had served as her thinking space throughout the investigation, and it was fitting that she should return to it now that peace had been restored to the village. Raymond had returned to London, armed with enough material for several detective stories and a renewed respect for his aunt's observational abilities. Before departing, he had pressed her to explain once more how she had seen through the elaborate staging to understand the true nature of the crime. "It's really quite simple, my dear," she had told him. "One must always remember that people are fundamentally consistent in their behaviour. A man like Pettigrew, accustomed to deceiving others through financial manipulation, would naturally attempt to deceive investigators through mechanical cleverness. But cleverness can be its own undoing when it draws attention to itself rather than deflecting it." "And the cat?" Raymond had asked. "How did you know to pay attention to what the cat had witnessed?" Miss Marple had smiled at this question. "Because, Raymond, a cat doesn't lie. Whiskers was genuinely terrified, and that terror had to have a cause. When I understood that he had been driven onto the roof by something he witnessed at ground level, it became clear that the body hadn't been placed there by someone climbing up, but by someone operating from a distance. The rest was simply a matter of understanding the geography and the mechanics." Now, alone in her garden, with only the roses for company, Miss Marple reflected on the broader lessons of the case. The murderers had believed they could create an unsolvable mystery through technical sophistication, but they had failed to account for the persistence of simple truth. The spotless shoes, the terrified cat, the rope marks on stone. These small realities had proven more powerful than any amount of elaborate deception. She thought too about Rosa Carmichael, whose observations and civic duty had set the investigation in motion. The retired schoolmistress had been vindicated by events, her instincts about Pettigrew's character proven correct. They had become friends through the shared experience, bonded by their understanding that vigilance and attention to detail were essential virtues in maintaining community safety. Mrs. Bantry appeared at the garden gate, waving cheerfully. "Jane, you must come inside. Dr. Haydock is here with the most amusing story about his examination of Whiskers. Apparently, the cat has been given a clean bill of health and a commendation for bravery from some fanciful organisation in London that concerns itself with animal welfare." Miss Marple set aside her pruning shears and made her way toward the house, reflecting that in the end, justice had been served and the village had survived another brush with the darker aspects of human nature. The cat on the parish roof had become part of St. Mary Mead's history, a reminder that even in the quietest corners of England, wickedness could flourish, and that eternal vigilance was the price of peace. As she entered her cottage and heard Dr. Haydock's jovial voice recounting his consultation with Whiskers, Miss Marple felt the satisfaction of work well done. Another puzzle solved, another truth revealed, another demonstration that careful observation and patient reasoning could always triumph over deception, no matter how cleverly constructed. The afternoon sun slanted through her sitting-room windows, casting warm light across the comfortable furniture and the many small treasures accumulated over a long life. In this peaceful setting, surrounded by friends and the gentle rhythms of village life, it was easy to forget the darkness that had briefly touched St. Mary Mead. But Miss Marple never forgot. She understood that human nature remained constant, that greed and fear would always tempt some toward wickedness, and that therefore the work of observation and truth-seeking was never truly finished. But for now, peace had returned. The cat was safe, the murderers were caught, and St. Mary Mead could resume its tranquil existence. Until the next time human nature revealed its darker aspects, Miss Marple would tend her garden, observe her neighbours, and remain ready to apply her particular talents to the service of justice and truth. Even a cat knows when a secret won't stay buried, as the saying went. And Miss Jane Marple, with her lifetime of careful observation, knew that truth, like the persistent green shoots of spring, would always find its way to the light.